I'm the founder and CEO of an investment platform called Prosper. You will see a little card in your book. If you want to go and investigate more about who we are, then please feel free to use the QR code on there. I am also an advisor to a wonderful business called Bokomi with Richard here. This event is in partnership with Bokomi. Bokomi hosts events in private members clubs across London and companies. Today we're hosting one in Old Sessions House. So I was just telling Charles, it's a 250-year-old, one of the first courthouses in Britain. Charles Dickens had his first job here as a reporter.
Really?
Yeah. So you're in great hallowed company.
Excellent.
Another reporter of equal talent here. So Oliver Twist actually was tried in Old Sessions House in the book. So there you go. So lots of literary heritage for us. So today I'm very, very excited, honored to have Charles Duhigg. Did I say your name?
You did.
Second
said it
name,
great.
right?
Yeah.
I didn't ask you that before, so that's good. Good, lucked out. With us, Charles, you've got I was sort of looking you up, as one does, stalking, born in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah. With us today, fantastic. Educated at Yale and Harvard Business School.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very impressive.
So 2 strikes against me.
Yeah, a few strikes against you. And has written for basically any of the brands in America that anyone in this country will actually know. So the LA Times, the New York Times, and now the New Yorker. Pulitzer Prize, slightly more than 10 years ago, and I do want to ask you about this, but this was a series of 10 articles on the business practices of technology companies. That
and particularly Apple. I don't know if you remember, but about a decade ago, there was this sort of real interest in what the conditions were like in the factories that were making iPhones and iPads. And so we spent a lot of time on that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And it was more complicated and interesting than we thought it would be.
Yeah. I mean, fantastic. So, and you've also written 3 books.
Yes.
So you wrote The Power of Habit, which I know I've been spammed by a bunch of people in this room going, this book was amazing, changed my life. And I'm going to make one connection to that later. Another one, Smarter, Faster, Better, continuing the theme of performance improvement in life. And then this one. So everybody in this room is super interested in Supercommunicators. It feels like a very meta conversation to be sat here talking about communication with you, Charles. And I probably have the easy job. If you read this book, you'll start to understand how a lot of this is about the questions and the active listening side of it. So my job is very easy today. So maybe if I start with probably the framing question. What is a supercommunicator?
It's a great...
And also, can anyone in this room be one?
Yeah, no, it is a great question. And I apologize in advance. We're going to make this very participatory. So I'm hoping that you guys will talk a lot, that we'll have a conversation. We might give you an assignment to talk to the person next to you. We'll see how things go. So let me ask, if any of you were having a bad day and you got home and you want to call someone, a mate, a family member, someone you know will just make you feel better, right? The call that you make just to pick you up. How many of you know who that person is? Okay, quite a few of you, right? And it probably came into your mind immediately. And for the people who don't know who that person is, if we spend a couple of minutes, I'll bet you would be able to figure out who that is. And that person for you is a super communicator. They know how to listen to you. They know how to show you that they're listening. They know exactly the right question to ask. And you, for them, are probably a super communicator right back. You're the person they call when they have a terrible day, when they're bored and they need a pick-me-up. We are all at various times super communicators where we can connect almost effortlessly with the people who matter to us. But what's interesting is that there are some people who can do this with literally anyone. Right? There are people who can connect with any person that they encounter. They can sort of make an instant connection. They know how to hear what goes unsaid. They know what questions to ask. And when I first started doing this research, I assumed this was because they were born that way, right? They were super charismatic, or they were extroverts, or they had been trained in the SAS, how to make good conversation as a weapon. And what I found was that all the research says that's not true at all. What it says is that communicating is just a series of skills. And that when we learn those skills, our brain makes them into habits very, very quickly, and we become better communicators. And so that's what Supercommunicators is about. It's about these skills, some of which are surprising and some of which aren't. But that if we remind ourselves of them, it's just easier to connect.
And so you're saying that these skills are not just something that someone needs to be in the SIS trained to do.
Yeah.
These are skills that we can.
Absolutely. Any single person can be a super communicator. You are super communicators at times. You walk into a meeting and you know exactly what to say. A friend calls you and you know exactly what to tell them to make them feel better or what to ask them. The question is, why does it happen sometimes and not others? And once we delineate those skills, we can do it whenever we want.
And you in the book, you refer to 3 different types of conversation.
Yeah.
And then the kind of 4 rules or laws, if you like. You want to maybe talk us through how someone in this room could recognize what
Absolutely.
conversations are?
So this started a little bit when I had this problem with my wife. I'm gonna pose it to you, and you can tell me if you've ever had something similar with your spouse. Very often, I would come home from work after a long day, and I would start complaining about my boss or my coworkers, and my wife very reasonably would say something like, "Oh, here's a solution. Why don't you take your boss out to lunch, and you guys can get to know each other?" And instead of being able to hear her give me a solution, I would say things like, "Why aren't you taking my side in this? Like I want you to be outraged on my behalf." And then she would get upset because I'm attacking her for giving me good advice. Anyone ever have this pattern in your own relationship? Sometimes it's the other way around, right? Maybe you're the one who's solving your wife's problems and she does not appreciate it. So this is common, right? And my wife and I have been married for 20 years. And so I started calling researchers and basically saying, I don't understand why this is happening. Because as I looked at it, I was also doing a bad job at work connecting with people who were my direct reports. And so I talked to these researchers, and feel free to come on in.
Yeah, please do.
And one of the things that they said, "Oh, actually, we're glad you called because we're living through this golden age of understanding communication for really the first time. Because of advances in neural imaging and data collection, we can study what happens inside people's brains when they're in conversation, as we never have been able to before." And here's the biggest thing we figured out. Most of the time when we go into a conversation, we think it's about one thing, right? We think we're talking about our day, or we're talking about where we want to go on holiday next year, or we're talking about what do we do about our kids' grades. And they said, what you're missing is that almost every conversation, every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And if you're not having the same kind of conversation as the other person, you really can't connect with each other. And they tend to fall into one of 3 buckets. There's practical conversations, right? When we're discussing plans, we're solving problems. There's emotional conversations where I come and I tell you how I'm feeling, and I do not want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize with me. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and the social identities that are important to us. And so obviously what was happening with me is I was coming home and having an emotional conversation, and my wife was having a practical conversation. We weren't matching each other. And that's where we get into trouble. Yeah. That's when miscommunication occurs.
So there's a lot in the neuroscience. I know there's a lot of people here who are interested in neuroscience, but there was one in particular, which was the Bow-Sievers thing. And you were talking about the synchronicity between people's brain.
It's absolutely fast. So in this conversation, but particularly if you're having a conversation where you're participating instead of just listening, you are completely unaware of it, but as that conversation unfolds, as it becomes a real conversation, your eyes will start dilating at the same rate of the person you're talking to. Your breath rates will start matching each other, as well as your heart rate. Now, none of us notice this, right? This is something that our bodies have evolved to do. And most importantly, if we could look inside your brains, what we would see is that the more and more you talk, the more and more your neural activity looks the same. And when you think about it, this makes sense because if I tell you about an emotion I'm experiencing or an idea that I had, the act of me telling you that, you kind of experience that emotion a little bit yourself, right? That's how you understand what I'm saying. You experience that same idea, not precisely the same way I am, but if we could look at our brains, what we would see is we would see that the neural activity is starting to look more and more similar. And you're exactly right. There's a guy named Bo Sivers. Yeah.
So how does that work when people on the phone in a two-dimensional context?
I'm sorry.
With the research, how does it work on video?
Oh, same thing.
It's
Same thing. It's what it's dependent on is it's dependent on the conversation and not the environment. Now, sometimes it's easier face-to-face to get into this synchronicity, what's known as neural entrainment. It's easier to do it much faster, in large part because if the environment is the same, we're fighting less things to align. But it doesn't matter if it's a telephone call. It doesn't matter if it's a Zoom call. In fact, they've done studies where they've looked at when talented writers are writing novels or something that you really like, you will experience the same neural activity that the writer had as he was writing that. And what's interesting is our brains have evolved to do this. If you think about it, communication is Homo sapiens' superpower, right? The thing that sets us apart from every other species is that we can talk to each other, which means we can exchange knowledge without having to learn it on our own. Mm. We can build families, we can build communities. Communication is what has made our species successful. And our brains have evolved to be very, very good at communication. They've evolved to seek out these opportunities for neural entrainment, to look for the clues about what you're feeling so that I can start feeling it too, even without you realizing what's happening. And that's important because it explains why these three kinds of conversations are so important to know about. Because when I'm having an emotional conversation, I'm using the amygdala, I'm using the basal ganglia, I'm using the sort of core of my brain. And when my wife makes a practical suggestion, she's using the prefrontal cortex, right? She's thinking in logical terms. Or if it's a social conversation, you're using something called the default network. And if we are using different parts of our brains, it's very hard for us to become aligned. It's very hard for us to become neurally entrained. And that's why we don't feel like we're really hearing each other.
How do you work on being more present enough to recognize the kind of conversation you're in?
So it's actually, well, let me ask all of you. Think back to the last important conversation that you had. Like the last conversation where like walking away from it, you were like either that was a great conversation or that didn't go as well as I'd hoped. Tell me, how hard was it to be present in that conversation? Was that?
easy.
It was easy. It was easy. Yeah, it felt like, and why? What is it about that conversation?
You're engaged.
You're engaged.
And this, you want to get the answers or questions you want to find out.
Yeah.
So you're right in the moment.
Yeah, it matters to you, right? It matters to you. You want to be there. And what's interesting is that we know that, we talk about listening problems. If you are watching a TV show you like or a podcast you like, you do not have any listening problems. It is not hard for you to pay attention to that show, right? If you're having a conversation where what's being said actually matters to you, it's not hard to listen. Now, there are things that can prevent us from having that conversation, though. And one of the biggest things is there's a question basically, how do we figure out what kind of conversation is happening? How do I know whether you're feeling emotional or practical? Because if you're in a business setting, regardless of what you're feeling, you're going to speak in practical ways, right? You're going to sort of put on this habit that you have of being logical. What we know is that the best way to figure out what someone wants from a conversation and where they're at is to ask them a question. And it's a special kind of question. It's what's known as a deep question. So a deep question is something that asks the other person or invites them to discuss their feelings or their values, their beliefs, or their experiences. And that sounds kind of intimidating, right? If I say ask people a deep question, except that it's as simple as saying like, oh, you're a doctor. Oh, the next logical question would be like, where do you practice medicine? But a deep question is to say, what made you decide to become a doctor? Like were you always interested in medicine? Or I know that you practice at the hospital. What's your favorite shift? Like, what do you love to see when people come in? What do you like about your job? these are easy questions to ask, right? There's a guy named Nicholas Epley who's at the University of Chicago who specializes in studying deep questions. And once a week he gets on a bus and he talks to a stranger. And his job for him, his assignment to himself, is within 3 questions to get them talking about their dreams or their experiences that are meaningful experiences. And he said, usually it takes like 2 questions, right? Because you say like, what do you do for a living? I'm an accountant. Oh, did you always want to be an accountant? That's interesting. Do you like being, like, what's it like? Like, what did you want to be when you were a kid? Was it an accountant? Now we're talking about our dreams.
I wouldn't try that one.
Yeah.
Apologies to any accountants.
Yeah. Excuse me. So when we ask these deep questions, 2 things happen. Number 1, usually the way we answer indicates what kind of mindset we're in, right? Think of the difference between asking someone, why did you become a doctor? And the same person might answer this question in 2 ways. If they're in a practical mindset, they might say like, look, I wanted a steady job. And this was like, yeah, that's what I love about medicine. It's a steady job. That same person at a different moment might say, oh, I saw my dad get sick when I was a kid. And I saw the doctors save him. And I wanted to be one of those guys. They're telling you I'm in a practical mindset, or I'm in an emotional mindset, or I'm in a social mindset. And all you have to do is look for the clue, and then you can match them. Then you can, the nice thing about a deep question is it feels very natural to answer our own question. Oh, you decided to become a doctor because you saw your dad get sick? That's funny. I'm a barrister. And when I was a kid, one of my best friend's dad, he actually ended up going to jail. And like I saw how the barrister had like played this role in their life. It allows us to connect with someone without it seeming like we're actually probing or doing something impolite or overstepping. But what do you think? Would that work, you think?
Sorry?
Would that work? Like what? Like?
Oh no, I think it's bang on. Like I work in sales and
Do you?
mimicking like the customer, like the tonality of what they're saying, the way they're trying to get across what they're thinking is really important, and also like matching them.
Yeah.
Then learning how to move the conversation to where you want to get to.
Right.
I was, when you were saying about the kind of boring questions, I was thinking of those like situational questions, like how many people work for you? It's important, but it's boring. But it's like, why do you have that many people working for you? Like how they.
Yeah. Sometimes the best way to do this, instead of asking people about the facts of their life, is ask them how they feel about their life. Does anyone here have teenagers? Okay. So like I have a 12-year-old and I'm like, what did you do today? Nothing.
Yeah.
How was school? Good. Did you learn anything? No. Right? Like you guys have all experienced this. It's like
This morning, in fact.
yeah. It's like hitting your head against a wall. Or I'll text him, I'm so proud of you, Harry. You're such a good boy. And he texts back, K.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I started doing is I started asking him deeper questions. And now I'm like, what'd you do after school? I played with Jasper. Oh, really? I know that you really like Jasper. I'm just wondering, what do you admire about Jasper? Like, what's so cool about him that you want to hang out with him? And then he starts opening up. He's like, oh, Jasper, he's really courageous. Oh, what does that mean? He's courageous. Like, what is courageous for you? Oh, he rode his bike off the roof the other day. And the easiest thing to do is to shut it down and be like, you should not do that. That is not actually courageous. But instead, what I did is I said, oh, that's interesting. Is like, do you think that, like, why do you think of that being courageous? Like, what else does he do that's courageous? And then it comes out, Jasper can talk to girls. And Harry really wants to talk to girls. And he's so impressed that Jasper has the courage to go talk to girls. I've just learned so much about my kid, right? This is what deep questions can do. Yeah.
Is there an issue when you've got 2 people effectively trying to do the same thing? So a bit like in sales, people do something like mirroring. If you both start mirroring something, you end up finishing their asking questions like back and forth, and you're like, hang on, are you mirroring?
No, so yes, if it's done, if it's done clumsily, then absolutely. And it's important to note that there's a difference between mimicry and matching. And my guess is when you talk about matching this person, you're not talking about mimicking them. You're not talking about just repeating what they said word for word, or they put their arms back and you put your arms back. You're probably authentically sort of listening to what they're saying and saying like, oh, I understand the problem your business is having. Like, I've seen other clients with the same problem. Can I tell you about what happened? So to your point, what we find is that when supercommunicators talk to other supercommunicators, that's when you talk to your best friends. You love it. right? Like the fact that you ask questions doesn't mean that you forget how to talk about yourself. It's just that you're actually both showing that you want to connect with each other.
Yeah. Just to put some structure around this for people, you talk about the 4 rules.
Yeah.
So once you can, so step 1 is I'm recognizing the conversation I'm in.
Right. I might ask a deep question
And then you're,
try and figure out, yeah.
And what comes after that?
So step 2 is I'm gonna see if emotions are part of this conversation. Because a lot of the time they are without the conversation being obvious about it. So I might do something like, if I say, we're sitting next to each other and I say, hey, what'd you do this weekend? Oh, I went to go see my kid's graduation. The most natural thing to do is to say, oh, congratulations, that's great. Like, now let's get down to the agenda, right? Let's start this meeting. But the better thing is to say, oh, that's really interesting. Like, what did that feel like to watch your kid walking across the stage? Was it awesome? And now what I'm doing is I'm inviting them to say to me whether they're feeling something emotional or not. And it's a very easy thing to ask, right? Nobody's gonna mind being asked like what it's like to watch their kid graduate. But they might say something like, it was great, it was really fantastic. Okay, here's the agenda. Or more likely they're gonna say, oh, it was amazing. Like I've been like so worried about this day for years and like, because he was not doing well in school and I did not think he was gonna graduate, but now he has. Now we're actually having a conversation, right? Now we're telling each other there are some emotions here that are undergirding things. So that's the second thing that we do. Yeah. The third thing that we do is we want to give everyone an opportunity to say what they want from this conversation. And this is for real conversations, right? And the way that we do that is we prove that we're listening to them. So think about how many times you're going into a conversation that you've been not looking forward to, or it's a little tense, and you have basically everything you want to say in your head, right? You're all professionals. This is part of being prepared. And you go into that conversation and you get your point across, maybe you want to change someone's mind, and they start talking back to you, and there's some part of your brain that says, you know what? They didn't hear me. They were just waiting their turn to speak. Has this ever happened to anyone? Yeah. Or they ask a question where they're like, oh, where'd you go on vacation? Because what they really want to do is tell you that they went on vacation to the Fiji, right? So what's interesting is when we're in that conversation, if we change our objective a little bit, and instead of thinking about the conversation is a success if I can get my argument across, if I can change your mind, and we say to ourselves, the conversation is a success just if we understand each other. Like if I can understand you and then you can understand me. And there's a simple technique for forcing yourself to listen more closely, to not letting yourself prepare for saying something in response, which is called looping for understanding. And you all do this at various times, right? You ask a question, preferably a deep question, and then you repeat back a little bit what the person said in your own words. Oh, what I hear you saying is, or let me ask a follow-up question because it was interesting that you mentioned. And then step number 3, and we often do this subtly, we ask the other person if we got it right. We ask for permission from them to acknowledge that we have listened to them. And this is the third really important step, is that oftentimes, even if you are listening closely, the other person does not believe you are listening.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because it's just human nature. Or it might actually also be because you really weren't listening. You feel like you're listening, right? And yeah. And so if we prove we're listening, not only does it convince that other person that we're listening, and so they're more likely to listen.
I wasn't
to us.
trying to prove I was listening.
No, you're good. You're good. But it also is like a hack for ourselves. If my job in this conversation is to repeat back what you're telling me, I can't start formulating the counter arguments in my head. I can't let myself get distracted. And then the fourth sort of principle is to try and figure out how social identities influence this conversation. Now, I'm American, and so I don't know what it's been like over the last 5 years in the UK, right? Since post George Floyd in the US, how many of you have had a conversation about race in, say, the last year and a half? Okay. And how many of you were like, man, can't wait to have more of those? That's really That was a good time. Anyone? Not so much? A little bit, maybe? And yet, talking about things like how we're different from each other is pretty important. I mean, if you're in business and you're dealing with someone who is a client who comes from a different ethnic background, a different social background, a different nation, different sexual orientation, you're not going to really connect with them unless like they feel like they can bring their whole self to the conversation. And so the question is, how do we do this? How do we have conversations about social identities? And what we found is that the key is to invite in many social identities. So if I say to you, sir, like, you know, I'm wondering as a man who's wearing a corduroy jacket, so you're probably don't work in the city, you're probably not a professional. I'm just wondering, like, what do you think about policing? You're gonna be like, fuck you. I'm pushing you into the stereotype. I'm pushing you into a corner. And nobody likes being pushed into a corner. And we can do it very easily, right, when we say like, hey, I'm just wondering as a black man, like, what's it like working at this, right? Or as a woman, is it harder to work inside this workplace? Like, are we good for women? This oftentimes makes the conversation go poorly. This might be what happened when you had that last conversation about race, is that you were just talking about race. But what we know is that if I say to you, sir, I know that you're a white man, but I also know that like you live in Soho and you have 2 kids, and you know I've gotten to know you a little bit. I've asked a couple questions, and I know that you actually have a brother who's a policeman, and I know that you coach the soccer team, and we're coworkers. And I'm just wondering, with all those different hats on, what do you think about policing? Then all of a sudden, we feel so empowered to bring our social identity out. And that is when we will tell the other person how we see ourselves in a social context. And that's the most valuable thing to know. Because otherwise it's underneath the covers and we're not aware of how it's influencing the conversation.
And I think you're touching on the heart of all of this is human connection, right? And the fact that, and I'm going to relate this back to the question before, and you might well connect with this from the point of view of having teenagers. I was very interested in connection in an online context, and the generation coming up, our kids, I don't know what yours are like, but the communication is very, very, very different. I'm just curious as to, in your research, have you come across things that, how is that online going to influence?
Absolutely. And by the way, I assume you do coach your sons. Did I get everything right? Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Oh, you used to run a bank. Okay. That probably.
Where do I put you off?
So you did work in the city. Okay. Okay. So let me ask this: How many people have kids? How many people are freaked out about how much time their kids are spending on their phones or their devices or online? Okay. And so let me ask you this: Why? Like, what is it about your kid being on that device that worries you?
Because I want them to have exercise.
Yeah.
I'm worried that too much TV or devices means they won't get enough exercise and won't be healthy.
It's totally fair.
Yeah.
What about other folks? Yeah.
It's particular apps rather than all of them. So having felt myself getting dragged into a horrible TikTok loop and sort of popping up 2 hours later, like it's usually like, oh, it feels wrong like when I do it. So
Yeah.
I don't want my child to experience that same kind of addictive kind of time loss that you get from someone else. On the other hand, if they're WhatsApping their friends, that's kind of, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Because they're communicating, they're chatting, feels better.
Yeah. Who else? Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, I think probably an example of being coming to a long conversation. I always go straight to like academic evidence, like anxiety, and the younger you have it,
Yeah.
call it direct mind stuff, and it never is like pushes looking around them.
Yeah.
And you're like telling them all this statistical evidence about why work was bad for kids, and just ignoring.
And they're like, Dad, when are you going to stop talking?
My daughter has this experience every day. So, Dad, all you care about is my mental health.
So what I love about these answers is it gets to this question of digital communication. And one of my favorite examples of this is about 100 years ago, telephones first became popular in both the US and UK. And there are all these studies that came out that said no one will ever be able to have a real conversation on the phone because you can't see each other. And if you look at the early transcripts of telephone conversations, they were right. Like you look at those like early transcripts of people telephoning each other, they used it like a telegram. They would call up and they would say, here's my shopping list, bye, right? Like there was no back and forth. It felt totally alien to them to have a conversation where you can't see the other person. Now, how many of you, by the time you were a teenager, could talk for like 7 hours a night on the phone and like they were the most important conversations of your life? All of us, right? And by the way, they were super boring. Like you did not have that much to talk about that was actually interesting, but you were interested by it. And so what happens is that we oftentimes learn to use communication methods. And to your point and your point, there's something very tricky about it. Different forms, different channels of communication have different rules. When you call someone on the phone, you're not aware of this at all, you over-enunciate your words. You put more emotion into your voice because you know the person can't see you. We do this automatically. This is consistent across almost every single person on earth. When there are different rules for being on the phone, similarly, we all know that there are different rules for sending an email versus talking face-to-face to someone, right? If we're sarcastic face-to-face, they can hear the sarcasm in our voice. But if we send them an email, they can't hear the sarcasm and they think we're being serious and they think we're a jerk. We know that these rules are different. So where do we get screwed up? We get screwed up in 2 places. Number 1, we get moving so fast that we stop reminding ourselves that different forms of communication have different rules, right? Before we send an email, we say, look, we don't say to ourselves, okay, let me just reread this. An email is different from a text, is different from a phone call. Let me just make sure like I'm doing what I need to in this particular format. And number 2, and this is the real danger with smartphones, we mistake communication for consumption. So I feel exactly the same way. If my son is Snapchatting his friends, I'm overjoyed. He's having a conversation. And they like send each other these like lists of emojis that like are coded messages, and I have no idea what they're talking about, which is probably the point. But when he starts looking at TikTok, when he starts looking at YouTube, when he's just watching instead of conversing, that is very worrisome to me. That's when we get isolated. That's when we stop going out and playing sports with our friends. That's when our mental health issues come up. And so as parents, one of the things that we can do is we can actually say to kids, don't mistake everything you do on your phone as being the same. You're exactly right. Some apps are good and some are bad. And I'm not going to tell you not to use the good ones, but I'm asking you to think about the bad ones. Yeah.
But there is also why something like, say, like WhatsApp has become a kind of social media where you're in a group with 100 people,
Yeah.
you post something, you're communicating, but you're also waiting to see if it likes it, no one likes it, 10 minutes later you're like, come on,
Yeah.
there's downsides even though it's communication.
Absolutely. And there's downsides to every form of communication, right? Communication is a tool. And like any tool, you can use an axe to build a house, and you can also use an axe to cut someone's head off. The tool really is about how thoughtfully you're wielding it. And absolutely, if you are someone who lets your emotional worth get wrapped up in who likes you on WhatsApp, that's probably a problem. But if we know what the tools are, at least we're better prepared to make deliberate choices.
So I wanted to, just conscious of time, I wanted to make this, make sure that you all have the chance to ask questions if you would like to. So anyone want to volunteer? Maybe someone who's not spoken before.
Yeah.
And there's a
communicate through emojis and Snapchats and just visual images of faces and stuff.
My kids do it all the time.
Super communicate.
Yeah. I mean, look, you know what an emoji is for our kids? It's an emotional expression. Like I write something and then I put a little like crying face next to it to show you like, I'm like this is how I'm feeling as I write this. We would never do that, right? Like it's alien to us. But my kids use emojis, they use digital communication to express what kind of conversation they want to have.
But isn't there too much pith in it? Because you can't get necessarily the nuance or to build and to deepen and to broaden. It's just like, here it is. Oh, you can see I'm unhappy.
Yeah.
It's red face.
I mean,
rather than
right.
why, you know what I mean? That's where I'm concerned.
Have you listened to a lot of 11-year-old conversations? that's all pith, right? There's no depth there. But to your point, you're exactly right. Like, and part of teaching our kids to be good communicators is saying, like, there's some kind of conversations that it's okay to have. Like, if you're fighting with your friend, are you fighting because you guys keep on texting each other? Like, would it be better if you just picked up the phone and called them? So I think so. But the point is that our brains are these things that have been designed for communication by evolution, by millions of years. That feeling you get after a great conversation, that like sense of joy and happiness, that's a product of evolution. This is what nudges us to connect with other people, to talk about real things. In our brains, for people like us, I'm Gen Z, we have like been whipsawed from one world into the next world. But our kids grew up knowing how to do this stuff. And all the studies tell us if we keep them away from the things where it's passive, where it's just receptive, and if we help them learn to use the communication things, they'll be as good on phones as we were on calling our friend when we were 7th grade.
You look really old for Gen Z.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's exactly. I usually go for the old look. I appreciate it. Oh yeah, please.
I feel like when conversations are the opposite of what you're describing, so not opened up, not evolved, not engaged, we kind of walk away and we're like, often I think we put it on the other person if we're aware, but we say something like, oh, they're not curious as one, or poor powers of expression, right? There's no depth. What do you attribute most like bad conversation to? Is it a lack of preparation, like lack of technique, or is it just actually those like human flaws?
So, and I'll mention, not everything has to be a conversation, right? Like when I tell my kids, like, I want to have a conversation about your rooms, I don't actually want to have a conversation about the rooms. I want them to go clean their damn rooms. So part of what might be happening is just that the people don't really want to have a conversation. They want to just transmit information to each other. But in general, when it doesn't go well, there seems to be two things that are happening. Number one is that people are anxious. And there's this experiment that we can do in a couple of minutes if we have time, where if you tell people to go talk to a stranger, it is the most stressful thing that will happen to them that day. Not the conversation. Telling them that they have to go talk to a stranger causes enormous anxiety, right? And as a result, it oftentimes screws up the beginning of the conversation. We're in our own head. We're not asking the right questions.
You had an amazing example about the hedge fund thing.
Yeah. So Nick Epley, this guy, and this is the experiment we can do if we have time. So Nick Epley at the University of Chicago, he comes into a room filled with about 200 hedge funders, most of whom don't know each other. And he says, here's what we're going to do. I want you to find a stranger. We're going to pair you up with a stranger. And you're going to have 5 minutes apiece. And what you need to do is ask and answer one question. And that question is, when was the last time you cried in front of someone? And then he goes, who's excited about this idea? And everybody in the audience is like, fuck you. Like, we are not, I'm here at a financial conference. I'm not going to talk about when I cried. I'm not even going to ask that question. But it's a captive audience. So he gives them the assignment. He pairs them up. They fill out a little survey about how much they're going to hate this thing. And then he starts the conversations. They're supposed to talk for 5 minutes each. He cannot get them to shut up until 45 minutes have passed. And the more powerful and the richer people are, the less that they'll shut up when they do this exercise. And they're just talking and talking and talking, and they're hugging each other. One guy is crying. And he eventually stops and he says, like, tell me what that experience was like. And one guy says, this is the best conversation I've had this year, right? And we know this is true. If you want, we can do it now. It's, you hate the idea of having this intimate conversation until you have it, at which point you feel great. Yeah. And so I think that's oftentimes what happens when we don't connect with someone is maybe we're trying to have different kind of conversations. Maybe we're not paying attention or showing that we're listening or actually listening. Or maybe we're just anxious and we need to do something to help us get over that anxiety. Yeah.
Well, what led you to want to explore all these things? I mean, was it your wife or?
Yeah. Part of it was my wife. Although she does often say, even now, she's like, you know, I noticed you were going on a lot at dinner. There's this book you might want to read to help you. Actually, the biggest thing for me was I got made a manager at the New York Times. And I was like, oh man, I'm gonna kill this. I'm gonna be so good at it, right? Like I've had managers my whole life. I got an MBA from Harvard Business School. And so I took the job and was like very, very certain I was gonna be good at it. And I was fine at the like logistics and strategy. And all of my employees absolutely hated me, despised me. And I could not figure out why, right? I wanted them to like me. And so I realized it's because I'm doing something wrong when I'm communicating with them. And so that's what started me on this path.
You had something about, was it the most direct or forceful leaders actually had the least alignment in companies?
Yeah, this is what we know, is that if you have a group of people together and you look at their neural alignment, if one group has a really strong leader, they become much less aligned because that leader kind of pushes people into their own thoughts. The groups that become more aligned are someone who has a non-obvious leader. Someone who's saying something like, hey, Jim, you had an idea before. Can you tell me what that was? Like, I thought that was really good. Or what I hear you saying is this, and tell me if I'm getting this right. Those people are the ones that we invite into conversations again and again. And they're not the smartest of our coworkers, and they're not the most charismatic, but you know who they are. And you know, when you see them on that agenda, you're like, I'm glad he's in the room, or she. Sorry, but did you have...
There's something around moving it from an emotional conversation back to a practical conversation.
Absolutely.
I've got people I manage who will tell you their emotional part of their life forever.
Yeah, they'll spend a lot of time. And I think, now, just because you don't ask about it or invite it does not mean that they're not going to tell you about their emotional life, right? They're just going to sort of like smuggle it into the conversation. So oftentimes we can just ask. When I come home and I talk to my wife and I start complaining, she says to me, do you want me to solve this problem or do you want me just to listen because you need to vent? And I never mind that. And I think when these situations, and again, it's person dependent, but saying like, I feel like I understand, thank you for sharing with me what you're feeling. I do think it's important that we talk about a plan going forward. Like, can I have your permission to like kind of start talking about solutions? And what studies show us is that when you do that, people actually appreciate it because they feel lost in the conversation. They feel like they don't know where things are going. They feel a little anxious. And when you take the tiller, you're helping them.
Can I ask about the computer elephant in the room and the rise of AI avatars and digital communication?
Yeah.
Is there a worry that the smart people of this world who are wasting their time in hacking us are going to be able to influence us in bad ways through digital avatars, digital communication? They'll learn the tricks. Computers will see the micro expressions and be able to super communicate back to us.
Oh, it's a great question, right? How many of you use AI on at least a weekly basis? What about a daily basis? You find yourself on GPT? So, and can I ask, how do you use it? Like, what's your...
Mostly, my 4-year-old son tells me what bedtime stories he wants, and so you then put in his themes and ChatGPT it.
Comes up with a bed. Yeah, it's great. It's amazing. It's the best. And then you can be like, I need this for a 4.5-year-old, but not a 5-year-old. Yeah. What about folks who raise their hand? How do you guys use GPT or AI? Yeah.
I'm an engineer, so it writes a lot of my code.
Okay. So it's sitting on your shoulder, right? You're using like GitHub Copilot or something like that? Yeah. So there's kind of two questions embedded in this. Let me tell you how my 15-year-old uses AI, GPT in particular. He reads a book that none of his friends have read, and then he goes onto GPT and he has a conversation with GPT about the book. And he loves it, right? Because he's like, oh my gosh, it brought up this idea that I hadn't thought of before, and like I didn't understand how these two parts. So he is completely comfortable having conversations with AI. Does anyone in this room feel like that describes you? Like we don't have conversations with AI, we use it like a tool. And so now the question becomes, should we be completely freaked out by this? That Ollie keeps on having conversations with AI, does it mean that he's gonna fall in love with a robot? And so and I'll tell you what the research says, because this isn't a new concern with different types of technology, with different types of representation. There are two things that our brain can do really, really well in addition to communicate. And this is actually why we can communicate. The first is It can listen very closely to vulnerability, almost against our will. Someone says something vulnerable, you can't help but listen. Number two, it has a hair trigger to pick up on insincerity or inauthenticity. And this makes total sense because in a state of nature on the plains, someone comes up and they are inauthentic or insincere, they are a threat, right? And we've all been in conversations where we say to ourselves, I don't know why this seems dodgy, but this guy seems dodgy. So what's interesting is every time we've seen an advance in technology, and I've worked with I did a story on OpenAI and spent a lot of time with them. There's the Turing test, right? When you think of the Turing test, can you tell the difference? That's actually the wrong test. The right test is, can an AI system convince you that it's being authentic? And there's almost no evidence whatsoever that it can. It can have a conversation with us, yet, and maybe this changes. But I actually think that you've tried this, right? You've put things into GPT, and some of it comes back and it's clever, and some of it comes back and you're like, I don't understand what's going on. As humans, we are so good at being consistently authentic, right? At not saying something random. And the systems might get better, but I think that it's unlikely that we're gonna very quickly get to a place where for meaningful conversations, for things you actually care about, you're gonna be convinced that you're talking to a person when you're talking to a machine. But we'll see. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. If the robot overlords come back and I'm in chains, then you know.
I think it's always that thing about we fear the short-term effects more than we fear the long-term effects.
Yeah.
We think the impact's going to be bigger in the short term, and it's actually not long for a bigger impact in the long term.
Yeah.
Because I'm surprised about the story, because whenever I read anything that the computer writes, the language is awful. It's like so clunky and terrible. Do you edit the story to your 4-year-old? Yeah, verbatim.
They're like, my dad does not write good stories. Like there's logical gaps. So
they're not normally particularly complicated. It's a more straightforward ways. ChatGPT can help.
Amazing. Any more? One over there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So with GPT, we obviously prompt them, right? So we're all getting prompting AI to get what we want from them. Do you think that makes us better communicators in the real world, or do you think that's going to make us worse? Because we're also going to want to start prompting our counterpart conversation without the answers we want to have.
Well, let me ask you, do you feel like talking on the phone, does that make you a better communicator or a worse communicator?
Depends on who I'm talking to.
It depends on who you're talking to, right? And you probably
I'm
sort
not
of...
picking up the phone to everyone, right?
Yeah.
Pick up the phone to my mom, for example, because I feel like she will read too much into text.
Okay.
I will not pick up the phone and bite fever to my brother.
So, yeah. So I think the answer is that a lot of it has to do with how we use the technology. That if we walk blindly into any kind of technology, it's probably going to have some negative downsides. That's what TikTok is, right? You look at it once and then suddenly half an hour later, you're still watching it. But if we're a little bit deliberate, I actually think that talking to my kid, he knows so much more about the books he reads. I could go find 3 reviews and 4 critical commentaries, and they're boring for him to read. But he reads Hegel, and he's like, Dad, I have some real thoughts on Hegel. And I'm like, okay. I'm just gonna listen because I literally have never understood Hegel. I think it can be a tool for us, but it's a tool. It's something we have to choose to use wisely instead of letting it use us. Yeah.
Are you optimistic of communication in the future?
I'm hugely optimistic.
Why would you expression?
So that's a good, deep question. Look, we're living through a tough time right now, right? I know that politics over here is as divided as it is in the US. I know that there are probably some people who are sort of freaked out by what's going on with the election in the United States and where it feels like we're not talking to each other. And the truth of the matter is that our countries at their best have been places where everyone has a conversation. If you just take the US, it was born in a constitutional convention. It's literally people who hated each other, just shouting at each other and having conversations and then writing a constitution. We definitely go through phases where we are worse at conversation. But every time this has happened, it's been a blip and we've actually gotten better. Right? Think about how many people you have conversations with every day that 50 years ago, you would never have a conversation with. 100 years ago, if you met someone with a different color skin or someone with who's obviously from a different class, you would have had such trouble having that conversation, even if you wanted to. I think it's gonna get better. I think it gets better, though, if we try and teach people these skills. And we used to teach them in schools, like British finishing schools, if you look at what the curriculum was for young ladies, they basically taught them to be conversationalists. And it used to be true in primary school too, that you had a close class like home ec or human relations. And those have disappeared from schools. So the more we do it, I think the more it gets better.
So Keir Starmer, I think, is going to bring in Horace's into like at the end of school, because he believes that it's one of the ways to kind of raise up people from a lower social status, because they struggle speaking in rooms like this because they feel intimidated. So he's going to bring that in as a kind of class to kind of help give confidence.
I think it's great. When I go to restaurants, I tell my kids that after they order and before the food comes, they have to go ask 3 strangers questions. And they hate it. And then they usually come back with like $20. I don't know what they're asking, but it like, yeah.
So I can see this is amazing for getting deep communication and being creative and deep relationships and that sort of thing. Are there techniques that a super communicator can use to sort of deflect difficult conversations? If someone's approaching you with aggression or they're angry with you, or how can you use the techniques?
Yeah, oftentimes you can sort of just refute, like say like, I don't want to match you, right? But the other thing that you can do is we can use a lot of nonverbal cues. So there's something interesting about laughter. 80% of the time when you laugh, it is not in response to anything funny. Right? Like, I didn't say anything funny and you just laughed, right? I'm not a comedian. So why do we laugh? Why do we laugh in conversations? We laugh to show the other person that we want to connect with them, and they laugh back, the most natural response, because they're showing that they want to connect with us. Now, if someone comes up and they're agitated and they're angry, laughing at them might not be the right thing to do. But it turns out all of our nonverbal, particularly emotional signals sort of serve the same purpose. So if someone comes up and they're agitated and you say, look, I hear that you're upset. Like, tell me why you're upset. And they tell you, and you prove that you're listening. You say, like, I hear you saying this and this and this. Usually it helps calm it down. Or you can just walk away. We don't have to have conversations with everyone. We get to pick and choose how we want to use it. I think, are we out of time?
We've got time for one more question. Anyone want to ask a dying one?
Sure.
Phil?
I think it's clear that you've learned a lot of really interesting stuff for yourself, which obviously you're sharing with us. I'm just interested, do you feel that this topic has given you back more than your other really good books, or is this at another level?
Good question.
I'm sorry, say it again. Is it?
Do you feel you've got more out of this book than you have from doing your other books for yourself?
That's a really good question. Yeah. The Power of Habit was pretty impactful for me. But it's different. Like the power, I don't know if people have read The Power of Habit. It's about how habits work in our brain. It's all about me, right? Like when I change my habits, it's all about like, how do I improve myself? How do I do? And I kept on getting emails from people who said things like, thank you so much. I was able to quit drinking. The ideas helped me. But there's this other person in my life that driving me crazy. How do I change their habits? How do I make them change? And yeah, right, yeah. And what the truth of the matter is, at least half of our success, if not more, is built on other people cooperating with us or communicating with us or doing something because we can bond with them. And so I would say The Power of Habit was very impactful in terms of like helping me try and figure out how to optimize my life. This book has been incredibly impactful in convincing me it is worth having these conversations every chance I can, because it makes your life so much better. And so I'll leave you with, I'm gonna ask you, I'm gonna challenge you to do something, which is in the next 24 hours, go up to someone, sit next to them on the tube or the bus. Maybe it's an uncle you haven't talked to in a while, go up to someone. Your first question is whatever you want it to be. You know, it's weird to start off with a really deep question first, but within 3 questions, ask them, when is the last time you cried in front of another person? And you hate this idea, and I promise you, afterwards, they're gonna tell you something interesting, and then you're gonna answer the same question yourself, and you're gonna go home and you're gonna talk to your spouse and say, I just had the most amazing conversation. I had no idea this was gonna happen today. So I'm Charles at charlesduhigg.com. Let me know how it goes. I'm very curious. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.